Welcome back, everybody. So we just talked about mitosis, which is how cells in the root are going to divide. What we haven't really talked about is development, right? How all those new cells that are produced by mitosis are going to turn into the mature tissues that we find inside of root. So those are things that you're familiar with from our last lab. That's like the epidermis, the ground, and vascular tissue system. Let's see here. We're going to start with roots because the cool thing about them is that you can kind of see their development happening as you scan your eye from the tip of the root and work your way upward. So the first thing I want to talk about are just some functions of roots. Right? How the root is going to function really within the plant body. One super important function of a root is that it's going to function really in anchorage. It's how the plant is going to anchor itself in space. It's going to stabilize it, hold it in that specific place. Another important function of a root is absorption. And you know this is why you water your vegetable garden, right? You water the soil in your vegetable garden so that that water can get absorbed by the roots and then go elsewhere in the plant, right? So that water that gets absorbed in the roots has to be conducted. And so conduction is another important function of the root. That water that's absorbed by the roots is going to get conducted up through the xylem to the other parts of the plant body that need that water. Finally, the last important function of a root is that roots are really important sites of storage. And I bet you know this as well. You've eaten big fat roots like carrots and beets before. You've seen, how large and swollen they can be because they're storing up resources. Well, the kind of growth that we're going to talk about in roots today is something called primary growth. Now, primary, I often abbreviate just like this, right? If you think about primary and secondary cell walls, what we've already seen. Primary growth is going to be how our plant parts get longer, right? Overall, the activity of primary growth is going to result in an increase in the length of our root stems and leaves. So it's how roots and stems get longer. And it's also how leaves are made. And all plants are going to go through this process, right, to produce new sections of roots and stems and to make new leaves. Now, as far as where all those cells come from, if we're taking sort of the root perspective, later in the course, we'll look at stems and leaves and how they're produced and how they go through growth. As far as where cells come from in the root, they come from something called the root apical meristem. And I often abbreviate this RAM, both in my spoken speech and also in my writing. Let's think about this word, root, right? So you know where we are in the plant body. Apical, right? Apex just means tip. So we're at the tip of the root. And then if you see this word meristem, you should think lots and lots of mitosis. Areas that are meristems inside of plants or other creatures are going to be areas of lots and lots of cell growth. And so the root apical meristem is going to be where new cells are produced by mitosis. And we'll look at the picture of the real thing in just a moment. But this root apical meristem, or RAM, is a ball of cells, right? It's a ball of cells that divides into two directions. Right? It buds off cells to both the interior and the exterior. And whether those cells are produced to the exterior or the interior, that's an R, I know it looks kind of like an N, that's going to determine their fate. So the exterior cells are going to turn into something called the root cap. which is really this protective structure that's over the tip of the root as it's growing through the soil. And the interior cells are going to turn into what we call the primary meristems. And primary meristems are what turn into primary tissues. So let's see this happening really, really quickly before we talk about the names of those primary meristems. All right, so here's my little root tip with all those little stages of mitosis. Let's look at it bigger. So down here at the tip, here is where that root apical meristem, remember those cells that divide to the outside to produce the root cap, right? If we look right here, here's that root apical meristem. These cells out here are forming that root cap. Now, this is a diagram showing the same thing, looking externally at a tiny little root. That root cap, you can see, is illustrated by these kind of yellowish cells right here, right? That's forming this protective barrier over the tip of the root, and it's helping protect that root as it grows through the soil. Above that is where the cells of the primary meristems are going to be produced. If I just go backward just a little bit, you can see the names of these three primary meristems. We'll add them to our notes in just a second, right? The procambium, the ground meristem, and the protoderm. So let's just write down the names of those three primary meristems. We've got these three primary meristems. We've got the protoderm. We've got the ground meristem. And finally, we've got the procambium. So the fate of these primary meristems is to really accomplish primary growth. And so these develop into primary tissues. Now, you know a lot about tissues already because we've already seen tissues. We've been introduced to them. And if you think about these word roots, they'll help you. If we think about derm, right? Derm means skin. Proto means first skin. And if you had to guess which primary tissue it turned into, I think you would probably guess the epidermis. Right? You've met the epidermis already. It's that outermost cell layer of our root stems and leaves. Right here, we're talking about it in the root. The ground meristem is going to be the primary meristem that turns into our ground tissue, which again, you've already met. And last but not least, right, we've got that procambium. Well, our only tissue that's left is going to be our vascular tissue. So that procambium turns into our vascular tissue, right? The xylem and the phloem. And if I just go back here really quick, right here we see those three primary meristems, right? Our procambium's in the center. That's going to turn into our vascular tissue in our root. Our ground meristem is kind of out here. That's going to turn into our ground tissue. And our protoderm is just this single cell layer. It's going to turn into that single cell layered epidermis. Now, here we can see that same external root. You know, as we scan our up this root, right, we can see it changing. We eventually see branch roots coming out the side. We eventually see those little root hairs falling off. What we're going to see in lab this week is we're going to see kind of what that internal anatomy looks like once all those cells of those primary meristems have turned into primary tissues. We'll leave it for there today. Have a great day.